I stood there in the hospital room, the smell of antiseptic and baby powder filling the air, my heart hammering with a mix of delight and bewilderment. My kid had just been born, our son. After all those years, hoping, praying, struggling through. The dark hours when it seemed like we'd never get here, he was finally here. I could still feel the weight of him in my arms from when the nurse first delivered him to me. Tiny, exquisite, his little chest rising and falling like a miracle I didn't deserve. Cassandra lay in the bed, her face exhausted yet blazing, and for a second I thought, this was it. This was the moment we'd been dreaming about. But then, she reached over, pulled the birth certificate off the clipboard, and everything changed. She didn't even glance at me, didn't ask, didn't hesitate. Our baby will take my mother's last name, she remarked, her voice chilly and sharp, like a knife slicing across the room. Not yours. I blinked. My mouth was dry. My brain rushed to catch up. What? I barely croaked out the word, scarcely heard above the hum of the hospital machinery. She turned her head, stared me straight in the eyes, and I saw something harsh in her, something I didn't recognize. You don't get to say, she sneered. It hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands tightened at my sides. I wanted to yell, demand an explanation, tell her this wasn't how this was supposed to be. We'd battled for this. Together. Years of tears, doctor visits, whispered vows in the dark, and now she was cutting me out, right from the start, like I was nothing. I opened my lips to speak, to fight back, but before I could get a word out, I felt a soft hand on my arm. The nurse, older, silent. Gray streaks in her hair, eyes that seemed to see too much. She leaned, in close, her voice a whisper meant only for me. Want me to tell her the truth? My heart froze. I didn't have to ask what she meant. I knew. I'd carried that secret for years, buried it deep, to protect Cassandra, to keep us moving forward. But now, with those words hanging in the air, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. I peered at the nurse, her face serene, but serious, then back at Cassandra, who was already writing her mother's name, Margaret's name, like it was a done deal, my son's name, my family, my house, all of it, sliding away, and I didn't know if I could stop it. The nurse waited, her hand still on my arm. I could feel the weight of her question pressing down on me. Did I want her to say it? Did I want to rip open the past? Right here, right now, in the room where my son had just taken his first breath. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I didn't answer. Not yet. But as Cassandra gave the clipboard back to the registrar, with that smug little twist of her head, I felt something snap inside me. This wasn't just about a name. This was about everything. Everything. We built everything I sacrificed, and the truth I had locked inside to shield her. I looked down at my son, sleeping in the cradle. His small fist curled up against his face, and I wondered, how had we gotten here? How could the woman I loved look at me like I was a stranger? How could she wipe me from our child's story without a second thought? The nurse squeezed my arm gently. A silent reminder that she was still there, still waiting. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't just surprised. I was angry. Angry at Cassandra. Angry at myself. Angry at the secret that had brought us to this point. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go without a fight. My son deserved better than that. I deserved better than that. And as I stood there, caught between silence and the truth, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let her take this from me. Not without one hell of a battle. Heart. Margaret spun around, her face twisted with contempt, ready to fire back. But before she could, the door opened. Angela strode in, her nurse's clipboard in hand, her stance straight and professional. She didn't flinch at Margaret's gaze. Just walked up to the bassinet, examined my son's chart, then turned to face us. "I can clarify this," she said, her tone firm, cutting through the noise like a knife. "I've seen the records. The husband's name is on the donor agreement because he was the only viable genetic parent. Cassandra's eggs weren't an option. That's why the donor was used. It's all recorded, everything legal." Her words hung there, clear and sharp, and I watched Margaret's mouth tighten, her eyes narrowing. Cassandra's head lifted slightly, her gaze darting to Angela, then to me. But she still didn't speak. Angela kept going, unfazed. He made the call. "To keep it quiet, yes, but there's no fraud here. The clinic followed protocol, he signed off, and she carried the baby. Those are the facts." Margaret's face grew red, her hands balling into fists, and then she erupted. "This is absurd," she yelled, her voice loud enough to make my ears ring. "You've humiliated my daughter. You've taken her child." The room trembled with her wrath, and I felt my own start to rise. How dare she say I took him? He was my son, my blood. The one thing I'd battled for when they tried to throw me out. But before I could snap back, Cassandra's voice burst through, soft and shaky. "Get out!" It was so quiet I almost missed it, and I wasn't sure who she meant. Me or her mother. Margaret stopped mid-rant, turning to her surprised. "What?" she said. Her tone sharp. Cassandra lifted her head, her eyes wet but hard now, and repeated it louder. "Get out!" Margaret blinked, her mouth opening like she was going to argue, but Cassandra cut her off. "I need to think. Just go." I stood there, my heart pounding, watching this crack emerge between them. Margaret huffed, grabbed her purse, and stormed out the door, slamming it behind her. The room went calm again, just myself, Cassandra, and our son. Angela gave me a slight nod, like she'd done her part, and slipped away too, leaving us alone. I looked at Cassandra, hoping for her to say anything, something, anything, but she just stared at the wall, her hands twisting the blanket. I didn't. "Want to hurt you?" I said finally, my voice harsh. I felt I was doing the right thing. She didn't speak, didn't even glance at me, but I noticed her jaw tighten, her shoulders hunch a little. The stillness stretched on, heavy and raw, and I realized she wasn't ready to discuss it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I sat down, the chair creaking under me, and watched her. This woman I'd adored for years, who'd borne our son but didn't know the complete tale until now. Margaret's fury had lit up the room, but Cassandra's stillness was what terrified me most. It wasn't apparent who she blamed, me for hiding it, her mother for blowing it up, or herself for not seeing it. All I knew was that the truth was out, and it had changed something between us, something I couldn't fix yet. I glanced at my son, sleeping through it all, and promised myself I'd fight for him, no matter what came next, even if it meant facing her silence or her rage head-on. 2 days later, we were discharged from the hospital, and I drove us home in silence, the car humming along the peaceful streets while Cassandra peered out the window, her arms crossed over her chest. Our son, Jonah, we'd finally settled on calling him, was strapped into his car seat in the rear, sleeping blissfully, his small cap slipping down over his forehead. I kept staring at him in the rearview mirror, this tiny bit of us, and it was the only thing keeping me steady. Cassandra hadn't said a word to me since Margaret stormed out. Not about the file, not about the name, nothing. Her silence was deafening, covering the space between us like a wall I couldn't scale. When we got home, Margaret was already there, her car in the driveway, her suitcases in the hall like she'd claimed the place. She'd moved in without asking, her voice booming through the house as she yelled commands about where to store Jonah's items. I took him inside, his carrier heavy in my hand.